And we're live.
What's up? I am David Long. Hope you're doing well today. What's up to my beautiful friends and fans in my I Am David Long Friends and Fans Facebook group. Hope y'all are doing magnificent today. Here with me is my buddy Alyosha, and we are going to be doing this integral review live. What's up, Alyosha?
Hey, what's up, guys?
Okay, so these guys, Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek, yes. He sounds like a Russian with a lisp or something. Very much like this. I can't, if whoever can do a good Slavoj Žižek impression, that's good stuff.
He's definitely a character. Hard to understand sometimes. When I was going through the debate, making notes, it was quite a challenge because he has his own kind of vocabulary. But that's not so much the problem, it's not the vocabulary, but the way he makes emphasis doesn't necessarily make sense. So he's almost speaking like Yoda in a way, but Yoda on cocaine that has a funny voice. Yeah, so it was...
Remind me to slap my wife when I get home for picking out this stupid shirt. I hate it. These stinking wardrobe malfunctions.
So I had to rewind and re-listen to just understand, okay, this is what he's saying. Yeah, so I had a little trouble with that. But once you get used to his styles, it's not a problem.
The first time I listened to it, I like to listen to things on like double speed so I can get through them fast, because I notice when people are trying to formulate their ideas, they're kind of slow with it. I'm like, let's go. Let's have it. So it was extra bad when it got to Žižek. I had to slow it down a little bit.
One thing good about Peterson, even though we can argue on the content, at least he is precise in terms of clarity of his voice. So it's really easy to understand Peterson, even if he uses vague words. But you can't argue with the fact he's an incredible speaker. Žižek he's a great speaker in his own little world, but I even read some comments. A lot of people had a hard time understanding.
What was your general ideas about this debate?
Well, first off, I can't blame Peterson, because Peterson was first off expecting that this is going to be like communism versus capitalism kind of debate. And then it turns out Žižek, he wasn't really defending communism in any kind of way. So it quickly kind of derailed after their opening statements, because Peterson was surprised that Žižek was not actually defending communism, at least not to the degree he expected. But in general, I liked Žižek a bit more. Whatever Jordan said, Žižek, he basically counter-argued the same point from a different point of view. So he sort of tried to open Peterson up to see that a lot of points that Peterson makes can easily be interpreted the other way around or taken out of context and so on. So I think Žižek did a good job showing Peterson that things are not as easy as he's trying to describe them. What was your opinion?
The frame of it is definitely misleading. The idea that it's a debate about happiness in communist versus capitalist systems, even throwing happiness in the frame just muddies it and makes it even more confusing. And then at the end of the day, it's not even really about that. The whole frame of the debate is completely wrong. Maybe they were just wanting to have a conversation, and this kind of frame got thrown on last minute as a way for people to be able to think about wrapping their mind around it. But it doesn't seem like that's really what happened. It's interesting because it doesn't deliver on what you think it's going to be. There's also this general kind of vibe while it's going down of like, people leading up to this debate thought, oh, finally, somebody is going to call Peterson on his ish about all this stuff that he talks about, Marxism and communism, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, let's get him to debate a real Marxist who can put him in his place, tell him that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So that's kind of how this debate even came to be in a lot of people's minds. And you can tell during Peterson's opening statement that that's how a lot of people in the audience are still thinking of it. They're like laughing at some of the things that he was saying. And then pretty early on in Žižek's first comment, he kind of shut some of this down. And he's like, we're not here to do this me versus him kind of thing. We're just going to have a reasonable debate. that really subverted a lot of people's expectations about what this debate was going to be. I think Žižek, even though it might not seem like it to some people, I think that he did have a strategy when it came to this debate that does undermine Peterson's ideas, just in a demonstrable kind of way. Peterson has these ideas like communists are these crazy people or violent or like all these kinds of strawmans that he wants to put out against them. And like, I think the fact that Žižek really embodies this Peterson idea of the goal is not to win, but to be somebody that it's fun to play with. And so in assuming this more calm and reasonable, likable position, he was able to demonstrate a way of contradicting Peterson's ideas and also even make himself more likable and reasonable to the point where they would want to have further discussion. Because up until this point, Peterson had made a lot of claims like he wouldn't want to talk to these people or that they're afraid to talk to him. In my recent video, I share a clip, the one with Wilbur and Peterson and Harris. Peterson says something about how if you're arguing with a communist and they say that what was represented versions of communism wasn't real communism, that you should knock them out, literally punch them in the face and knock them out, advocating for that. So we didn't see him knock Žižek out. But it's interesting because I do think this debate did in some ways put an end to a lot of very tough talk from Peterson that he didn't really follow through on when he was actually dealing with a Marxist in a debate in person.
Another thing Žižek did really well is that he basically exposed, based on what I heard, that Jordan didn't really read anything beyond Communist Manifesto. And again, he's making a career out of criticizing Marxism, so I would at least expect him to read some of his other stuff like Das Kapital and many other essays Marx made. For me to just, and we're going to get to that, but I felt like if anybody didn't clean his room or do his homework, it was actually Peterson who, even when Žižek asked him, well, who are these Marxists that you're preaching about? He couldn't name any name. So he more or less exposed Peterson that he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah,
and,
he did it very casually and calmly.
I don't think Žižek wanted to destroy Peterson in a way. He tried to make it sound like very lighthearted. He was making fun. But I think that if he could have easily make Peterson look like an idiot if he wanted to. I think Žižek realized at some point that Peterson doesn't know a lot on the subject of postmodernism, especially about Marxism. But he didn't do it. He didn't want to destroy his career or whatever. But he could have. And it is kind of disappointing that Peterson doesn't, if he's making a career out of criticizing these ideas, at least read some basics, right? So I was a bit disappointed on Peterson on that front. So, but we will get to that.
Yeah, I kind of feel like Peterson may have won the debate in terms of capitalist versus Marxism, but I think that Žižek actually undermines all of his ideas. And even though he kind of technically lost the debate, I think he casually still undoes Peterson without even trying, really. It seems to me that's kind of how it went down.
I think if Žižek really tried, he could have probably obliterated Peterson, because I know he knows a lot more than he's leading on.
But he didn't want to take that kind of stance against him, and I
don't think that's the point of the debate. I agree that the idea is, let's just talk about ideas. It's not about I'm going to destroy him or he's going to destroy me. And I agree that Peterson kind of won the debate in terms of defending capitalism, and all the points Peterson makes are to some extent legit. I do think that Žižek kind of showed the lack of, how should I say, like philosophical depth that seems like Peterson really doesn't have at all. At the beginning, both people had opening statements, and we're going to start with the Peterson one. Peterson, he said that he reread the Communist Manifesto, which is 40 pages, good for him. And he said he almost never read a book that has so many fundamental mistakes about how things work than Communist Manifesto. But then this is the first interesting kind of point after that. He says fundamental truth is that almost all ideas are wrong. And I don't know why he said that, because I would not expect him to make this postmodernist claim, but it almost seems like he was saying that to almost prepare himself in case he was attacked, to go to this original point and say, well, what do we really know? Everything's wrong, psyche is complex, and try to weasel out if Žižek would try to pinpoint some stuff. But he didn't really have to go that way. What did you think? Do you remember that part when he said all truths are basically wrong or something like that?
I can see what you mean about like how he could potentially set that up as like a backdoor to weasel out of. One of the things that struck me right off the bat was I noticed that he took a different strategy in these debates than he took in the Sam Harris debates to try and seem reasonable. What we see him do, I think, in these opening statements is set up a series of straw men. He's not like starting by trying to steel man. And this gets down to this, one of the other first things that he said that you kind of touched on. He talks about what it means to read a book. He basically describes a very analytical read. What I want to say about this is that I don't think that that is how you read a book in a scholarly way. I think the scholarly way to read a book is that you start by giving the sympathetic read. You start by really being like, okay, I'm not going to nitpick at this guy's things. I'm going to listen to him. I'm going to see what his point is. I'm going to give the most generous and sympathetic perspective to him that I can to really see what he's about. That's the first read. The second read is the one where you're critical and you make them earn every point. But what happens when you don't give that first generous read is you end up missing the central point and then nitpicking a bunch of bullshit around the edges that's not even necessary to the central point. I don't really feel like he's doing a skillful or a respectful goodwill kind of interpretation of Marx in the first place. And that's a problem. If you're a teacher, let's say you're teaching psychology, the way that you want to teach it is you don't start like, here's Freud, he's bullshit, let me tell you why. This is not how you start. You go, here's Freud, like these are the ideas that happened before him, and these are the revolutionary new ideas that he brings to the table. Like these are the upgrades that he brings. And then people are like, oh yeah, that's good. Okay, now that you like him, this is why he's wrong. And they're like, oh yeah. That's how you should move people through learning about something, so that way you get both the pros and the cons, and not this kind of like, well, here's somebody, let me knock down this bullshit. That's not an integral approach. That's not a skillful approach. And it's, I feel like, a complete departure from the good work and the goodwill that he set up in previous debates.
And also, problem is that Communist Manifesto is a 30 to 40 page book. You can't really make any kind of deeper points about Marxism or communism based on that book because it's so freaking vague. Even if you wanted to, there's so many things that Marx is letting out that you just have like a vague picture of what Marx is trying to do. And we also need to take into the context the fact that this book was more written for a normal working man. This was like a manifesto for everyday person. This wasn't like a deep philosophical discussion from Marx.
Very good point.
So even from that standpoint, I think there's a lot of things missing, but whatever, let's just go forward. And then the second point, he says that every idea that you think about, you should try to prove it wrong, which I agree with Peterson. Ask yourself how all this could go wrong. If you're a Marxist and you're writing about Communist Manifesto, ask yourself, how could I screw this up and everything could go wrong? He's basically saying that Marx never asked himself that question. And I like this idea. I think that all ideas, I'm right now writing a book and I'm constantly asking myself in the process of writing, how could all these ideas I'm bringing to the table could be wrong or false, and always try to find counter explanations. So I think that's a good point from Peterson. I just feel like he doesn't do that enough with his own ideas. But
right, exactly. Well, doesn't Žižek counter that point later and say that in a different work, Marx does lay out a whole bunch of different possible ways that it could go, and that what we've seen through history is that he was actually right about some of that stuff. Yeah, Peterson is not really familiar with his work. And like you're saying, he's treating this general, vague manifesto as if it's like a philosophical treatise or something like that, and then basing his ideas of all communism ever based on that. It's ridiculous. Like some of the claims he makes are like, we don't see any kind of plans about how they would have any central organization or governance. It's like, dude, people have been working on these problems for years and years and years and years after this book that you're talking about was written. And there's a whole bunch of communal-minded, socially minded people who've come up with a whole bunch of different strategies. And we see that they work not only on the small scale and in co-ops and stuff like that, but in businesses. A lot of these things have been put to work and they work. He really does fight a bunch of straw men that are easy for him to defeat with this binary thinking. Honestly, I kind of wish he did get a little bit of what was coming to him, that somebody did kind of hold his feet to the fire and take him apart a little bit on some of this stuff, because he is putting out a bunch of, I would say, misinformation and spreading these kind of straw mans. And even still, he hasn't really been called to task on this stuff in public. The internet made some videos about it, about how he got a lot of this stuff wrong. By the way, I think my favorite commentaries that I've seen on this stuff so far are Peter Joseph's takedown of Peterson's opening statements and Zero Books talking about Žižek. So if you're interested in digging in more, I think those are some good places to go.
Yeah, I agree. Also, Chuck Philosophy did a great video on postmodernism and how Jordan doesn't understand postmodernism. Also, go check him out as well. So the next thing, we can see that Jordan is a huge admirer of Carl Gustav Jung. Carl Gustav talked about the idea that a lot of people have problems. He was basically arguing that a lot of people just think thoughts and they just assume these thoughts are correct and just take them as truth, and that a lot of people don't have ability to think about their own thinking. Obviously, there's some truth to that, and some people don't, but I wouldn't go anywhere near to say that Marx is one of those people. Even in Communist Manifesto, Marx admits that it's by far the best system in terms of productivity, so GDP and so on. And again, again, I don't think this counts to Marx. Sure, Marx has some blind spots on many issues, but to say Marx is one of those people based on just reading one freaking book from him, again, it's extremely disrespectful to Marx, in my opinion.
He's given him crap for writing at a low level, like, oh, this is something that my students might write. It's like, yeah, because it's a manifesto for people who are common man thinkers. He's incredibly uncharitable.
It's kind of ironic that Jordan starts with these ideas like thinking without thinking what you're thinking, but then he goes and just strawmans the whole biology. He's basically arguing that the whole Communist Manifesto's idea and Marx's idea in general is that all history can be reduced to class struggle between the proletariat and bourgeoisie. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it right, but bourgeoisie meaning the higher class, the rich people, and a proletarian means the lower class, the working class. Marx basically reduces all to the class struggle, which is kind of funny because Jordan reduces everything to biology. He says that our history is deeper than class struggle. It's in biology. So it's like this winner takes all mentality. And he's basing that, believe it or not, on lobster behavior. Humans are far more complex than lobsters. To actually make the whole theory of human behavior based on freaking lobsters, are you kidding me? This is such a straw man of human nature and evolutionary biology. And
yeah.
I don't even know where to start on that subject.
It kind of reminds me of moral argument that I sometimes hear from people about eating meat. They go, well, it's been good for us in the past. It's like helped our evolution, which is true. And, you know, we're at the top of the food chain. It's like this kind of might makes right. They're like so proud of themselves from being at the top of the food chain, and yet their morality is still might makes right. If you're really the superior being, then maybe you should act like one. You know what I mean? And make good choices. So this idea of the appeal to nature, oh, well, that's how we've done things in the past. That's what it is to be an animal. Yeah, but we're also supposed to be cognitively advanced animals who don't just act like animals anymore. And we shouldn't just be acting out dominator hierarchy narrative. And he doesn't really make any kind of distinctions between different kinds of hierarchies or healthy and unhealthy hierarchies. It's just this kind of naturalistic fallacy, like appeal to nature as a justification for dominator hierarchies. Like, this is some old school thinking. Like, this is the kind of shit racists and stuff use. This thinking is just, it's terrible and ridiculous. And for it to be taken seriously as an argument in the year 2019 is just embarrassing.
For anybody who's arguing about the lobster thingy, I actually heard that lobsters piss from their mouth. I don't see Peterson saying, well, we should try to piss through our mouths then if lobsters do it, right? So again, so it's kind of a straw man in that sense. So then another thing Jordan is saying is that it's not always easy to see who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. So basically he's criticizing Marx for just saying that the bourgeoisie are always the oppressors and the working class is always the oppressed. But sometimes that might not be the case. And obviously we can debate it and say, sure, but I think Marx was more talking about in general.
Like, yeah, like why create this blurry line? And since when is the guy who's so into these kinds of false binaries like heaven and hell, like now he wants to be like, oh, nuance. Let's be clear, the people who have surplus and are just living off of other people and don't actually really contribute anything, but they have more than they can spend in multiple lifetimes. These people are the bourgeoisie. And I mean, obviously, if this is a manifesto written for the public man so that way they can wrap their mind around some of these ideas in a vague, simple way, creating some kind of a simple binary where they can be like, oh, some people are slaves and some people are masters is something that they can wrap their head around.
This is where Jordan's binary thinking comes. And he's basically, I think, criticizing Marxism's binary thinking by saying that Marx always presupposes that all good is always at the proletarian and all the bad is at the bourgeoisie. So again, he's basically assuming that Marx seems to always think that the bourgeoisie is always the bad people, always the villains, and the struggling working men are always the good people. I don't think that's the case.
It's missing the point. I feel like the part of the idea is that these roles end up being inevitably baked into this kind of a society. It's not like Marx is demonizing certain people. He's saying within this kind of a structure, you are inevitably going to have haves and have-nots. You are inevitably going to have some people who get to live like kings while other people are exploited. And that is an inherently bad system. He's saying we can get to this point where we can make sure that everybody is taken care of. This is why Peterson's approach to this conversation is not really honest. He's much more interested in picking at these little things that aren't even a real representation of what the ideas are supposed to be about than really addressing any of the central point. He just sets up a series of nitpicky straw mans and then cuts them down without really really ever seriously considering the possibility of a healthy version. Obviously, you and I are not advocates for communism. We're integralists, so we recognize the value of both the individual and the communal themes. And I think all people at an integral perspective are going to want to synthesize these themes in some way. So you have some people who are more interested in the short-term translation in terms of synthesis, and so you get conscious capitalism or conscious consumerism, this idea of let's do it in a good way. And then you have more long-term people who are more interested in moving more towards communal themes and then nesting the individual themes inside the communal themes, like collective individualism, where you would still have the communal needs-based society where we share resources in terms of the economic sphere, but there would still be healthy social hierarchies and meritocratic hierarchies and hierarchies where people could work to become great, and that's including the individual themes. Where I'm going with this is that he doesn't at all try to be sympathetic towards the things that communism brings to the table. He just says, oh, well, it doesn't include hierarchy, so it's bound to fail. It's like, okay, but then he also talks trash about the idea of having some kind of order and structure. So it's like, look, you don't think that you could give any kind of a sympathetic read to where you could think, well, how could it work? What would that be like? How could we make it work? Even though I think that capitalism or whatever is kind of doomed to fail, that there have been a lot of people who have thought about, well, how could we make it work by introducing in some of these communal themes to try to help balance it out? And that definitely makes things better. Ever since laissez-faire capitalism failed in the 1920s with the Great Depression and we started with the New Deal, we've been incorporating and including these communal themes into our individualistic frameworks to try to balance out and to even make the thing work. Neither one of these extremes works on their own. They both do need each other if they're going to work. The whole thing is rooted in an incomplex false binary where we get stuck on one side versus the other. They both fail.
One of the things, and that to some extent this is a legit criticism, so then Jordan says, who is to assume that even if proletariat would win, would also not become corrupt? Who is gonna choose the right people? So what I'm basically arguing is that he's sort of falsely assuming that capitalism has like a natural way of showing who can rise in the hierarchy. Again, I feel like Jordan has this neoclassical, neo-Darwinian way of how hierarchy is supposed to work based on his stupid lobster theory. So the idea is that the most competent people will always come on top of capitalism, which is just a ludicrously stupid idea. That's
we see that happening.
You have so, and I'm gonna be one of those people who says there are a lot of CEOs who are psychopaths. I'm not saying competence never wins. Don't get me wrong. Sure, if you're a good doctor, you will probably have more chance to succeed, even that's debatable. But
yeah.
I'm not saying competence never is the case, but a lot of times, especially in corporate circles, it's not about how competent you are, but whose boss's dick you're gonna suck, how gorgeous you are. There are so many other things that get you through the hierarchy, and competence is the last thing that gets you there, especially if you're in a bigger corporation. They don't give a shit about your competence. They only give a shit that you work your stupid 8 to 12 hour job, do whatever you must do, and even if your ideas are great, you're trying to get forward, the likelihood of you getting ahead instead of the CEO's son, well, good luck with that. Capitalism does oppress a lot of people. Imagine if YouTube didn't exist. You know how many people would need to do such a boring, stupid job in some corporation if social media didn't help them? And again, of course, we can argue capitalism is the best system, and it is in terms of productivity, giving us all these products.
Yeah, so far.
Some capitalists saying, well, you're using the phone from capitalism, why don't you say thank you to that? Yeah, I am. But people who made those phones, some of them want to do suicide. So again, this idea that capitalism is a perfect system, even a good system, is all debatable. Although I will give Jordan credit, he does mention that he's only defending capitalism versus Marxism. But he did admit that he's not saying capitalism is the best system. So I'll give him at least credit. He did specifically say, I'm just doing this comparing to communism. But then my argument would be, if you think capitalism is better than communism, but what is better to capitalism? He never sort of answered this question.
To touch on that point that you made before, Jordan at one point, and maybe this is in your notes somewhere too, he says something like, you don't succeed by oppressing people or taking advantage or exploiting people, that's not a good way to do business. And that might be true if you're on a small scale running a mom and pop business, but we don't see Walmart doing this kind of stuff. One of the problems with capitalism is, and this gets into the issues capitalism and democracy. It seems, touching back on that point before about Peterson acting like communism necessarily deflates into some kind of form of totalitarianism. Of course, there are versions of communism that I would say are some of the highest and best versions of democracy that you could even possibly have. have. There are some really good integral governance systems that are real democracy where we can actually figure some of this stuff out, and it wouldn't be the kind of top-down leadership that you would see. So that's not really true. But one of the things to kind of bring it back around, the way that capitalism works with democracy, which is very similar to Peterson's ideas about how the reason why Christianity is so popular and rises to the top, it's this kind of appeal to popularity seems to be this general theme where it's like, let the market decide what's good and true. So it's like the market decided that Christianity was true. See, that's why it's the most true. It rings and resonates with the most people. And it's one of the problems with capitalism and democracy is, oh, well, you can just buy whatever you want, you know, like, and let the market decide. Well, on that micro scale, like you and I, we can't just choose whatever we want. We can only choose what's on the shelf at the store, and we can only choose what we can afford. When most people are poor, what that means is not only planned obsolescence and all that stuff, but you also get cheap, crappy products. This is why Walmart and McDonald's are so popular. That this is not really good or healthy democracy, even in capitalism. And this idea of democracy through popularity is not a healthy way of deciding what's good or true. That seems to be a fundamental confusion in Peterson's mind.
Jordan sort of believes that we were built for trouble, and if we get everything we wanted, we would go on something he calls creative destruction.
Right.
So something unexpected would happen. I don't know exactly where he gets those ideas. I assume he sort of thinks that if we are born in sin, there's this invisible destructive force within us. If Hitler got whatever he wanted, Stalin got whatever he wanted, but whenever you have somebody who gets on top of the chain, gets what he wants, he becomes corrupt. So this is sort of how Jordan sees human nature. Let's make an alternative universe and say Obama was there instead of Stalin. Would Obama, with mindset he has, become Stalin? And I think the answer would be no. If we switch places, we might actually see these things work a lot better. So I don't see why one would say, well, if anybody gets whatever they want, we would just be a part of this creative destruction and just destroy the whole universe. I don't know. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's a pre-trans fallacy. I talk about it a little bit in my pre-trans fallacy video. Everybody tends to think that their stage of development is the highest stage of development. Religious people, they tend to have this narrative where you're either a conformist, you're either a good boy, or you're a rebel. On Peterson's view, a real atheist is a killer, is a murderer, is a person who gives into their impulses and does whatever they want because there's no God to stop them. That's red. Orange is rational. They're going to be good not because God told them to, but because it's a reasonable thing to do, to be a good citizen and to try to succeed. And they have reasons to not be bad beyond you're going to go to hell. His whole idea there is deeply flawed, and this is why he doesn't really have a good view of development. This is another one of his major problems, is he tends to almost think development goes up until the conventional stages and then dips back down again like a mountain. Then you're going to go off the cliff, you're going to go over to the other side, back into nihilism, back into doing whatever you want. That's like conformity and convention are like the peak of development, and you're sliding off on immaturity on either side or something. He doesn't really have a healthy view of development, and definitely if you're trying to move past post-conventional stages, he's a boss you got to beat to be able to do that. He will stand in your way.
Afterwards, he says that let capitalism play out unless you expect all capitalists to take all the televisions. The televisions they won't take, but your money, they probably try to do everything they can. It's a problem that 1% has the 50% of world's wealth and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Although Peterson does admit that's a problem, and of course it is, but we'll see. Let's just continue to the next point.
What's this deal with like the televisions too? It's like, if you have a television, then it's okay. As long as I have a television, I'll be happy. As long as they don't steal all the televisions.
So then he goes into the idea that he doesn't know how to set up a system with equality. And capitalism produces wealth, and other systems just inequality. So basically he's saying two things. First off, he doesn't know what kind of system we need. Sure, capitalism produces inequality. He admits that, and we have like unhealthy hierarchies, but at least it's productive.
I want to go back real quick and come back to this point. I'm just remembering something that you said that I really want to get to, this idea of human nature would just end up shutting everything down. Within integral systems, we have it set up to where we process people's tension skillfully. So good ideas could come from anywhere. There's literally no reason to rebel against a system that processes everybody's tensions. And there's also no room for corruption. The leaders of the system are the ones who run the processes, but they can't influence the decisions. So when you actually have a skillful decision-making process in place that's open and transparent and everybody can participate in it, and it's like a for real type of direct democracy, there's no need to have riots and stuff. This kind of stuff comes when you have all this shadow from people not being able to be heard and not to have their tensions processed. Just the fact that we live in a culture, in a world where a high school student could do a report to be like, look, this is bad, this is wrong, this is not true. And that information that's widely available just gets completely ignored in favor of what's popular. I don't know. Well, let's take a vote on it. That's a completely unskillful system and decision-making process, and it's going to inevitably lead to injustice. I definitely think that solutions can be built into the system to where you aren't going to have people just rebelling to break stuff. If you give people good paths to be able to actually express themselves and there aren't all these systematic problems like coming up in their way, I think people will just rise and shine and kick ass and be awesome for the most part. I don't think that people are going to just start ish just to start ish. That's a very negative view of human nature.
For the closing statement, this is the first part when Jordan was speaking. So he basically goes into the stats saying that sure, there's income inequality, but there's also growth, the GDP. Richer are getting richer, but poorer are getting rich too. And obviously, sure, this is true if you look at GDP and stuff like that. Yeah, capitalism has done a lot more than any other systems did. But in defense of other systems, capitalism happens to be right at the moment where we had this technological boom. So it's questionable whether other systems would not be able to bring something to the table as well.
That's a very good point.
I do expect that capitalism would probably bring the most diversity versus other systems. But to say that only capitalism would get more poor people out of poverty, again, that's debatable, but okay, let's ignore my point there.
I'm also skeptical of that. I wonder how many factors were taken into account. Does that take into account inflation and all these kinds of things? It seems people who are doing trade jobs and stuff paid pretty much the same amount as they were a long time ago. And just because we've seen the minimum wage go up and up and up, yeah, but money is also worth less and less and less and less. It seems those rates are not going at the same pace to be able to really keep up with it. And so while it might look like on certain papers that the poor are getting richer, I'm actually skeptical of that.
We would probably need to check some really detailed research papers around this topic. A lot of researchers can also have their own biases. So whenever you have any kind of systemic research, it's always harder and harder to get to the concrete answers because societal research is a lot more abstract. It's one thing to look at an atom and see, oh, water is two hydrogens and oxygen, but it's a lot harder to do a research on large scale and see how people behave and so on. But I'll give Peterson the benefit of the doubt and say he did enough research to see that capitalism helped. So let's go to the opening statement number 2, which is from Slavoj Žižek. And Žižek actually started with an interesting point about China. He's obviously the greatest economic success story in the last few decades and has found this weird kind of mixture of communism and capitalism. Obviously, I'm not studying China's social economy or their system, but it is something worthwhile to think about. How is it possible that you have this communist/capitalist country? So it's a communist in terms of how it behaves to its citizens. Communists have the control. Communists are the CEOs of the free market that they're running there.
I don't know much about what's going on in China, but it seems to me that a lot of the places that call themselves communist are actually more totalitarian dictatorships that run their country like a business within capitalism or something like that. But would you say people who make this kind of communist argument about not real communism? I did hear, though, that China, my friend told me this, that they try to put their leaders through a bunch of tests and to see if they know about things, and they like vet their leaders, educate them on topics before they're qualified to be leaders. That might be something America might want to adopt.
Are you saying Donald Trump is not qualified? How dare you? The next thing Žižek says, we pretend to desire things that we do not really. So I think this is what Žižek said. Conservatives, they think that the problem is losing connection with divinity or higher values. If everything is relative, all the lowest tendencies, this is something you said before, it's a pretense fallacy. So this is something that Jordan sort of believes. Yeah, if you kind of lose your higher values or divinity or whatever, your animal in nature will come in line. By believing in God and having rules, that makes you a good person, right?
Right.
And Andrei Glucksmann, who wrote the book Dostoevsky in Manhattan, he wrote, if there is God, everything is permitted for those who claim to act.
If God is dead, everything is permitted. He's flipping it on.
Like I said at the beginning, Žižek just turns it around and says, see, but this is how we can also interpret it. And the 9/11, 2001 is a proof of that, right? So if Allah or Krishna says to me, well, I should do this to do this, then everything is permitted. So you can obviously turn this around as well. And another thing he mentions is that Stalinist communists also saw themselves as godly creatures. So he was basically implying that a lot of these communists were not like rational people. They saw themselves as being by divine order. So again, another thing that Žižek sort of says, that there was a lot of religious religious themes within the Communist Party, because a lot of religious people think that all of them were atheists, which is not the case at all. The next point he says, that was at 49 minutes, Hitler is the greatest storyteller. We are all telling stories to ourselves in order to acquire meaning in our life. Stories we tell ourselves are usually lie and truth is out there. Žižek just trying to say that all stories we tell ourselves are usually lies.
Yeah, and it sounds like they kind of agree too, right?
Yeah, they agree with that. Yeah, they agree. Although they don't talk about how to translate them in a meaningful and rational way like we do in the Integral Review Life about Joseph Campbell.
Early on, Peterson says that most ideas are wrong. Žižek here seems to be kind of echoing that. It's a postmodern idea of this is all just stories we tell each other. We're all just playing games with each other. The truth is a different thing to be had. This is kind of where Peterson also contradicts himself too, right? Because with Harris, he wants to say that there's only the story. But if he's saying earlier that most ideas are wrong, again, that would imply that there is some kind of absolute truth to be had. Peterson contradicts himself when it comes to truth.
So the next point is, and this is something that also Žižek noticed, which is called, I noted it as a right projection. Alt-right is actually blaming Marxists, so they see them as a plot for moral degradation, consumerism, and sexual promiscuity. He's basically arguing that this isn't Marxist, but it's capitalism who's doing that. In a book called Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism, is that capitalism is undermining moral Protestant ethics, and it's not Marxism. So it seems like alt-right is sort of projecting the problems of capitalism onto Marxism. It's those Marxists who are the perverts, and our capitalist system is all okay. Žižek says that Marxism today plays the same role as Jewish did in Nazism, when Nazis needed the external force to blame for potential social collapse. So when Hitler came online, he was saying, oh, this is all the Jewish plot. The Jews are trying to destroy our beautiful German society. Similar thing is happening, obviously not as gruesome scale as it did in Second World War, but that's some good point from Žižek.
It's this old theme of demonizing and scapegoating communism. It's actually really intellectually lazy. Part of the problem is that people don't know about history. And when people have been taught about history, at least in America, most history is taught around wars. When you're taught history through the lens of philosophy and psychology, you can see that these wars and these different things are more like symptoms or outcomes of certain things than they are the real driving force. You have to understand these ideas in context, is what I'm saying. This big society thing that we're doing, this industrialized modern society, it had never been done before. And it is really new, like really new. And it kind of failed right off the bat. People were afraid if they were even going to be able to hold together society. A really great documentary by Adam Curtis is Century of the Self, where he's talking about how psychology and all this stuff was used to create consumerism, because before industrial revolution, people bought things based on need. So they had to figure out how to psychologically engineer a new kind of person to fit the type of environment that we were creating, this kind of new world with whole new bigger society. So this project is very, very new, maybe 100 years old. So at the time when this stuff was coming out, there was a whole bunch of people who were experimenting with ideas about communism and capitalism and how to hold together a society, like all over the world. In Japan, they have their own kind of way of coming up with a solution. We're talking about in China, we see what happened in Russia. Basically, the world was running a bunch of different experiments on how to do this kind of thing. And at that time, one of our biggest enemies was communism. And so we kind of created this crazy us and them demonization hype around it. And we're finding even now, 100 years later, we're even still struggling to integrate our shadow around this stuff and to really take an honest look about what some of the pros of these systems might be. It's kind of crazy. It's a very deep shadow, and it's really stopped us from being able to have reasonable conversations about how to have a society.
Yeah, whenever you mention Marxism, people, maybe older generations a bit more, I think that younger generation, things like Leninism, Marxism, Trotsky, people are trying to look in those ideas more now than they did before. Communism does have renowned interest again. And I think that's a good thing, because this is an opportunity to see what it can bring to the table without just demonizing, which is what a lot of Americans seem to do. I think Western propaganda really brainwashed Americans, especially Americans. Just by mentioning Marxism, they're out of the conversation without even having the decency to at least try to find what Marx was trying to do. Even if you don't agree with the whole meta theory of what Marxism is trying to achieve, we created this huge allergy towards this and not seeing it in context and what we can learn from it.
As postmodernism comes online, they do start to reintegrate and relook at some of these antithetical types of themes. There's a whole communalism kind of thing that happens at Green with postmodernism and hippies and stuff like that. And so there is kind of a link where some of that stuff starts to come back online. And that's probably why we're now able to have this kind of talk in America is because postmodernism has come so much back online that we're actually able to start to consider some of these ideas, hopefully in a more intellectual light. But I mean, we see even still Jordan Peterson attacking all these strawmans and bringing up all of these shadows out of the closet, and we're still working on it. Still an issue.
Žižek not only mentioned the right, but also left. So Trump is the result of the failed left liberals. It projects some imminent protagonism of the external cause, the same way why liberals can understand how our liberal society gave birth to Trump. So the image of Donald Trump is also a fetish. The very liberal gaze that gave rise to Trump is also evil. Just like the right-wingers are projecting onto Marxism, liberals, by not understanding the working class people, created Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Donald Trump is a result of liberal blindness, which is also an interesting point Žižek made.
I think it's even more than that. People are generally disillusioned with the system as it is, and they don't have faith in the idea of voting and representative democracy and any of this stuff anymore. Most people think that these people are corporate puppets, and they mostly are. If anything, even a lot of people who were young and postmodernist probably also winded up voting for Trump just kind of as the fuck you Joker kind of vote. So I don't think it's just as simple as the left doesn't understand the right. The left isn't even one thing anymore. You have your orange left and your green left and your your integral left. And we all have different ideas. We're not even a coherent thing anymore. Part of the problem with this whole two-party system is that you just have two people screaming at each other, and it's kind of a divide and conquer type situation at the end of the day. They're both puppets owned by the same corporation. And while the real difference between the two might be something like this person's socially conservative, this person's more socially progressive, the underlying stuff is the same. They're both in bed with corporations to get stuff done that they want done. And people just focus on the surface issues, and they don't really think about or even see some of the deeper fundamental issues. They're just more interested in the small injustices in their own life. And that's why, we'll let the gays marry, and we'll throw these people a bone. And maybe if enough people show that they want it, we'll even let them smoke weed or whatever it is. None of the real deeper systematic problems really get addressed or changed.
Another thing that Žižek pointed out is that neoliberals blaming Eurocentrism or Western centrism for being immoral or selfish makes it even more immoral and selfish. Basically, he's trying to argue that because a lot of postmodernists are blaming, why don't we let more refugees in and stuff like that, that makes other more conservative people in Germany even more selfish, even more protective, even though neoliberals are trying to criticize Eurocentrism. And then going to the topic of egoism, altruism, and envy, evil in some sense is more spiritual than goodness. Egalitarianism should not be accepted as the face value. I'm willing to renounce something so that others won't have it. So basically, he sees altruism as I'm willing to renounce something so some other people won't have it, not so much in terms of I want to give so other people will get as well, something like that. I don't know exactly what he was hinting at here, but
I think the metaphor that he used was if some kind of angel came to one person and said, I'll give you whatever you want, but whatever I give to you, I'll give your neighbor double. And he's like, well, I guess take one of my eyes then. This is a very pessimistic view of human nature. Maybe these dudes are both psychologists, right? I think what happened with Freud and some of these people who are like Freud is classically has this idea of just underneath the surface of the unconscious is bubbling up all of this animalistic, crazy sexual energy that's just like ready to explode. And I think the reason he thinks this is because he takes person after person into a room and he's like, so tell me what's going on with you. And then he uncovers all this unconscious animal stuff. And that's just terrifying. It's like, oh my God, all these people, they seem like they're so normal. But if you dig under the surface, you find out that they're just crazy animals who want to fucking kill all the time. I think this gives these kinds of psychoanalysts and stuff a very pessimistic and limited view of human nature and development. Sure, we're animals. Sure, there's parts of us that want to fucking kill all the time. But we can also develop into higher stages of development where we can learn to supplement and beautify our animal nature, as well as recognize the fragileness and vulnerability of other creatures and want to love and give out of abundance and stuff. And that maybe, it's not everybody, but maybe we should let some of these more mature people be the ones who are in charge. And if we have some kind of a process of decision making, maybe there's a way that we could figure out a way to systemically move towards the progressive and away from these kinds of impulsive childish, animalistic sort of impulses. Sure, yes, it's part of our nature. I feel like it's a very limited view of what a person is.
I can understand where Freud was coming from. If you're somebody who's dedicating your whole life into psychoanalysis, speaking with all these people who have hysteria, who have all sorts of psychoanalytic issues, I can totally understand why he would come to such conclusions.
He was like the first word on a lot of this stuff. Sure, he didn't get it all right. I'm very sympathetic to his perspective. You could see why being one of the first people to peer into this stuff, especially from people at the time who were probably mostly around red and blue, this would be some troubling stuff to see, and it would probably make you concerned about human nature in general. That's also the amazing thing when you start to look back on history, even of some of like the early films and stuff like that we have of people. In some ways, people from the past are more well-spoken, but in some ways, I do feel people now are just like cognitively more advanced and like we have a lot more going on. It's really interesting. People tend to not give people from the past enough credit sometimes, and that can definitely be a problem. Times are changing. People are changing.
I agree with that, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this, but another thing that Žižek said is that political correctness masks the reality of defeat. So Terena Burke, who was the founder of the Me Too movement, observed that it deployed a huge obsession with the perpetrators. A lot of Me Too movement, I assume at the beginning it was more let's just spread awareness. But now what happens is a lot of people just became obsessed with men, trying to think about rape culture a bit more and what we can do about it. Became this obsession with this rapist man, and a lot of feminists went way too far and just see evil in every man's eye. And so maybe she had some regrets around that.
The Me Too thing was very interesting because, like you're saying, it started about people sharing and wanting to come out and be like, yeah, me too. Like I've also had to struggle with this kind of thing. And it went from a very personal thing. On the back end, a bunch of people lost their careers over it. I'm not saying that's not a good thing. Maybe some of these dudes had been creepy for a long time and they had been getting away with it. It is about time something happened about it. But there was also some weird things too, where it's like when guys would come out and say, me too, I've also been molested or whatever. A lot of times these people were attacked and it's like, this isn't about you. You know what I mean? But also there's this whole, while it's great to be in solidarity and it's great to get that perspective on just how many people that we know who are saying me too, and that is a powerful thing. It also seemed to feed into this whole victim mentality and trying to get attention on the internet for things that have happened to you, like sympathy comments and stuff. Both the victim mentality and the woe is me kind of Facebook comments are both in general kind of turnoffs to me. I wish more people would try to seize their power and not frame themselves in a negative kind of way. So I see pros and cons to it. It is interesting as a phenomenon to see what happened with that. Definitely had some unintended consequences. It was very revealing.
So the next thing that Žižek says is, should we drop egalitarianism? And he says, no. Equality can mean creating a space to as many people, possible individuals, can develop different potential. It's today's capitalism that equalizes us too much and causes the loss of many talents.
That is so true.
Žižek is incredibly good at reversing. When you think, well, capitalism gives us opportunity, right? Tries to say that whoever works hard deserves us the most. But Žižek sort of twists it around and says it's capitalism that actually equalizes us too much. And that's actually true because to be successful in our system, a lot of things need to go right. For instance, why is Rian Johnson a director of Star Wars Episode 8? Is he the most competent person? There are many YouTubers who could direct, and they're not even directors, who could direct a better freaking Star Wars Episode 8 than he does. So obviously, and there are million examples of why competence doesn't necessarily mean getting on top of the hierarchy. And I think social media sort of just proves that, because you see, just look at the YouTube and video production. How many people are talented video makers that would never see a day of light if it wasn't for YouTube? What we realized with social media, although I don't think Žižek was trying to get to that point, but what I'm trying to upgrade what he's saying is that with social media and all this video culture and so on, we see just how many young people are really talented. Their talents cannot get across because corporations don't need talented people. They need stupid people to do their stupid shit that nobody wants to do. Again, this idea that Jordan has that competency will get you anywhere. No, we actually don't want people to be competent because we want you to work in a stupid store. You don't need to be competent there. Just be nice and do your shit. From that kind of perspective, it does equalizes us too much. So what's your opinion on that?
I think one of the greatest wasted resources is human potential. This is why I like the idea of collective individualism, where it's like every person is given optimal chances to realize their potential instead of this kind of, oh, you fight for it and I'll kick you while you're down kind of system. Our system does kick you while you're down. If you don't fight hard for it at the bottom, if you're not being a good boy, if you don't play hard, you get swept up. If you're not a good indentured servant, you'll become a for real slave. They'll scoop you up and put you in jail for being poor or homeless if you can't make it, if you're not willing to go do some stupid, life-wasting, mind-numbing, soul-crushing, bullish job, a machine could easily do better than you. That's the other thing, too, is it slows progress in terms of automation and stuff like that. We could already be doing a lot better instead of having a bunch of poor people's hands in your food. It could be made by machines never touched by human hands. Not only does capitalism create substandard products and stuff, they constantly are talking about like, oh, there's not enough jobs. What are we going to have enough jobs? Are people going to have jobs? Like, people don't even want these jobs. Like, these jobs suck. Nobody wants to do this with their life. These are terrible, soul-crushing jobs that don't help you with meritocracy. They don't help you develop your skills or get better. A lot of jobs are just soul-crushing, terrible work. And that's not even getting into the straight-up slave labor that we employ in other countries to get the mine the minerals that we need and the stuff like that. We all, I would hope, have a pretty good understanding of the problems with capitalism. If not, I would suggest that you check out some of that Peter Joseph stuff like Culture in Decline or maybe Zeitgeist Addendums.
In terms of technical analysis, I think Peter Joseph is probably good. Also, Richard D. Wolff is great. The next thing Žižek talks about is equality versus hierarchy. It's too much equality in the US. Look at Bernie Sanders. He's basically just putting forward what Europe did half a century ago, creating social democracy, and America sees it as a threat to democracy and the American way of life and freedoms. Europe already figured out a century ago that you need some kind of a healthy version of capitalism and socialism, and it's not just one extreme or the other. And America sees that free healthcare, free education. Oh my God, they're trying to take my freedom away. How dare they? So it's interesting how westernized America is on this subject.
It's a very simple idea of liberty, too. It's all hands off my ish type liberty. Freedom from anyone coming and messing with me is freedom. But the problem with this is that there's both positive and negative liberty. And a lot of times people claim their freedoms at the expenses of systems that support them. If you're free to go pick an apple off that tree, now that's an apple that someone isn't able to get. If we say, oh, we're going to extend rights and freedoms to parents of children to raise them how they want, you're taking away the rights from the child to be able to be protected from his potentially abusive parents. It's a trade-off. It's not like as simple as freedom. Freedom is complicated, especially when the lines between where your freedom ends and my freedom begins start when we have to share a world together and share resources. This idea of freedom is kind of related to this idea of individuals as these kind of cut off and separate islands. And that's just not true. It's not true about how reality works. We are connected. Everything that you do affects the world that I have to live in. There's nothing that you can do that doesn't affect me.
Another important point Žižek made is, so free healthcare education enables me to focus on things that are really important to create differences and also different hierarchies. He goes on to say competence is created politically and nature is not as simple as lobster hierarchies. It's full of improvisation. The origin of many French dishes or drinks were mistakes and then they sold them as successes. Nature is not as simple as Peterson is trying to present. Always the strongest people will come on top or the most competent or whatever that means. The nature biology is full of improvisations. A lot of French dishes and drinks were at first mistakes, but then they became a huge success. Although this is kind of outside the biological point, it's not as easy as Peterson is pretending evolution works. Yeah.
And on that biological point, the bonobos, for example, he studied this group of monkeys, and one of these groups of monkeys was hanging out outside of a hotel or something like that. They had a very male-dominant, patriarchal, hierarchical structure. So what he found was the males actually at the top got poisoned because they were able to get access to stuff and hoard things that other people didn't get. And so they all died. And then the only people that were left were some of the more females and the more like outsider males. They set up a new kind of society and a new kind of structure that's a lot more egalitarian, it's a lot more social. And sometimes they would have males come from other tribes that weren't used to this kind of structure, and it would take them 6 months or something like that to adapt to the new structure, but eventually they would. Even though there is still a hierarchy in this society, it's a lot more matriarchal, it's a lot more egalitarian, and it runs differently. This is to his point. It was kind of a mistake that this happened to all of these men, but it's actually more peaceful, and there's less stress hormones in all of these monkeys in relation to hierarchy. And what he found is that there's a better quality of life in these monkeys because they have less strict hierarchies. So there's a pretty direct correlation, it seems, between strict hierarchy inequalities and the amount of stress in a culture.
Alpha male in one environment might not be an alpha male in another environment. Just like a competent person in one environment might not be a competent person in another environment. And for Jordan to just sort of make this broad stroke of what competency even means. So basically, he's just saying that in capitalism, competence, always the competent people will be on top. Again, that's way oversimplifying. Why is competency? Where is competency? There's so many other questions that we need to answer here. It's not always that the most competent people are on top. A lot of CEOs are psychopaths, don't care about nature, they don't care about other living beings. It's all about money. To say those people are the most competent, maybe they are in terms of making money. But then the question is making money something we should consider competent? Maybe
Trump is like a prime example.
Let's say you have a doctor who is trying to find a cure for cancer. Let's say he finds it, but he's not good at, I don't know, selling shit. Well, does that mean he's not competent in capitalistic terms since he doesn't know how to sell shit? Well, of course not.
Right.
You can't make a broad stroke of competence. You can't do that. And yet Peterson just keeps doing that. And
right. Capitalism doesn't reward competence. It rewards a particular type of competence that works well for what the environment's got going. Yeah.
The next thing he said is biological sexuality can change one's behavior drastically based on the culture he's born in. Culture and the ideas that a human mind is made of can drastically change how one views sexuality and override biological sexuality. So one would say, well, if we look at like a straw man sexuality, we would say, well, men are attracted to women and that's it. But obviously in nature, you have gays, you have pedophilia, you have all sorts of shit in nature. You can't just straw man biology into some simplistic binary terms. Well, biology just means men should be attracted to women, period, because reproduction is the only thing important. Evolution is a lot more complex than just mere survival replication. And when you put in culture as well, things still drastically change.
It's really unskillful how he tries to root everything back down into biology and create this kind of, well, this is nature. It's like, it's really the only thing that he has to ground anything in to try to make a case for things. He's got that sort of postmodern view of what's the most objective thing I could point to as a grounding force is like nature. You definitely get into the naturalistic fallacy when you start doing that kind of stuff and appeals to popularity and all these kinds of problematic issues. It's pretty unskillful.
The example that Žižek made was that power is a lot more mysterious and political competence and power should be split since communists pose as fake experts to gain power. So basically what Žižek said, that a lot of these communists who became on top, it's very hard to say that whether Stalin was the most competent kind of person if we are looking at a natural way of achieving power, as if evolution created this deep mysterious competency scale that only the most quote-unquote competent people will come on top. Power is a lot more mysterious. We should not like strawman power and competency and hierarchies and all these things into this simplistic, naturistic kind of game that Peterson is trying to propose here.
Simplistic and unclear view of hierarchies, where he's just conflating a bunch of different things together and speaking in very vague language about it. It's not very helpful.
So the next point that Žižek addresses, admitting communism was a failure, but does capitalism have enough antagonism to sustain its cyclical consumption, like an ecological catastrophe, techno-scientific development, like biogenetics, AI, and so on? All this antagonism Marx called commons, shared substance of our society. We have this huge technological boom. A lot of things in capitalism can get out of hand. We can just start with genetics. Maybe you can create genetically modified supreme beings that are a lot more intelligent than we are. Not to mention the problem with AI that Sam Harris was talking about. If we have this free market, how with all this?
That's terrifying.
What is capitalism going to do about that? That's absolutely terrifying. Yeah.
And that is a good reason why we need some mature leaders at the top who are making some real skillful decision making, not just rooted in might makes right, top down or bottom up bias. We really need to figure out what we're going to do about some of this stuff, or we will kill ourselves and destroy everything. Very serious stuff.
Žižek mentioned that there is not enough data to act in a collective way to stop the potential environmental collapse. But capitalism and its managers, not because they're evil, but because they don't care about this problem. In communism, the situation was even worse. So basically, he's saying that because the system we live in, the cyclical market economy, managers don't necessarily care about the environment. This is another problem that free market will probably not be able to address.
There's this idea of if you actually have a common space like that people won't take care of it because there's no governance. I think we're kind of pointing to that problem, maybe, and that's what he means with capitalism too. It's like we have these kind of common problems. How does the market actually deal with it? If the problem of the commons is a problem for communism on a small scale, maybe it's also a problem for capitalism on a large scale with these big issues. Common shared problems, it takes collective rather than individual values to take care of it. Yeah, commons require communing.
Oh, yeah, in that sense, yeah, okay. So it's in a way, a collectivism.
Yeah.
And Žižek goes talking about the true utopia. So the true utopia is that we need to look at the causes, not the symptoms. True utopia is to think that we will survive without such a change. A lot of these societal changes, all the way from global warming, polluting the ocean, all the things that capitalism and free market is creating, the true utopia is not going towards some utopic system, which some people sort of judge communists as they're utopian, right? But true utopia is to have a blind eye towards free market capitalism. And if we don't look at it for what it really is and what it promotes, Žižek probably believes that we won't change until something drastically bad happens.
That's a great point. What's really delusional is actually thinking that we can continue to do this when it's clearly destroying humanity and really unsustainable and not very skillful. And again, I think people don't have a good understanding of history. Like I said, even this modern society is not that old. It's pretty new. I think people just tend to think, oh, well, this is just how it's always been. This is probably how it'll always be. No, we are in dynamic flux and things are actually changing fast, and we don't even have that firm of roots in the first place. We really have no idea how to do this. We are in the middle of a project. We're kind of making it up as we go and figuring it out as we go. This whole new modern, postmodern plus thing is totally new.
And we live in a society that is making some huge changes, and usually it took some time for society to change. But since the technological boom from industrial age, especially nowadays, just from the 90s, for instance, in the 90s, which is 30 years back, we didn't have social media. So social media came online in 2007. So even just in this 10, 12 years, ever since social media exists, we drastically changed our way of life. And who knows what's the next huge thing? And it's hard for society to keep up. And from that point, I can sort of understand why Jordan Peterson tries to regress to some proven kind of values, because everything's changing so fast that you're thinking, damn, how are we going to create a whole new society? Let's just go back to what we know and maybe then try to do something new. So I can understand Jordan's concern here.
But Žižek makes a really good point here. We have to change. It's not like we can just keep doing it. That's actually crazy and suicidal and willfully ignorant of the problems that we have, that we can't just be romantic about this, that we have to seriously make some changes.
Next point is that Žižek argues that capitalist market does great things. Žižek admits that capitalism does great things, but neoliberalism is an illusion. Neoliberalism in terms of there is free market. Free market basically never exists. State plays a very important role in today's capitalism. The market is already limited, but not in the right way. So basically he's arguing that the state does not do a good job of regulating capitalism in this moment. Žižek believes despite protests here and there, we will steer into apocalypse for a large catastrophic event to awaken us. Even if somebody tries to convince me that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, it's just another train coming towards us. Žižek sort of spills out his view on the world, and he admits that he is like realistic pessimist.
Couple that with his view on human nature, and it makes sense that he would think that. And I get what he means. People think technology will save us or something like that, and to some extent, I think he's right. This new technology that we're thinking is going to save us might be the thing that destroys us, and that's very possible. This is part of why I'm so passionate about some kind of a revolutionary movement and figuring out how to actually do this stuff, is because I agree with Žižek. To continue down this track is a catastrophe. It's strange because we really might already be too late in terms of global climate change and all the kind of stuff. Like, who knows what we've already done? At least we can try. I think we need to really take these problems that we have seriously. I feel like a lot of people, especially in the integral community, a lot of them even believe in Omega Point, where humans reach perfection and stuff like that, like the Steve McIntosh kind of people. Wilbur seems to be pretty optimistic and doesn't seem to be too worried about global warming or any of this kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, humans are going to continue to develop, and it's like, it's fine. I'm more sympathetic to someone like Žižek, who's like, yeah, we're in serious trouble and we might still kill ourselves, even if we do a real good job of trying to fix it. I do think that we're in serious trouble. So I feel like there's some serious urgency.
Wilbur would just say, well, you just need to wake up and you don't have to feed the children.
Just wake up and realize the ground of all being, and then everyone will be fed.
If you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream, you can try to feed them all. But the second is you can wake up. And that will end their suffering immediately.
So these were the first statements from both people, and then we have a 10-minute response. So we're going to start with Jordan Peterson. So this is a good point from Jordan Peterson. Obviously, we don't want to just criticize him, but I'll give him credit for this point. He was saying, I was defending capitalism because this is like a capitalism versus communism versus Marxism kind of thing. And he explicitly said, I'm not saying capitalism is the best or doesn't have its problems. He's basically admitting that the capitalism might not have all the problems. He's just saying that the reason he's defending the capitalism versus any other system is because he feels like it's still the best system we have so far. So then the next thing he says is not being miserable versus being happy. So a lot of psychological literature, it's actually about not being miserable versus being happy. So what you want to strive for in life is not trying to be happy, but just not trying to be miserable.
I think it's still a very self-centered view. It's not really a moral perspective that the goal is for me to feel some kind of way. Like, this is where I'm kind of confused about his view, like how it doesn't even seem that Christian to me. From a Christian kind of perspective, you would want to live your life in service of caring about others and poor and like trying to be a vehicle for love to other people in the world. And I would say that you would measure your success in life based on how much you were able to do that. This whole idea of personal happiness, I really like MLK quote where he said something like, most people forget in their attempts to be happy that the surest way to be happy is to try and find happiness for someone else. I think our morality shouldn't be based on individual happiness, but on the greatest good and the most sustainability and the ways that we can make the most people's lives better, the general good, not personal happiness. That would be my opinion.
Then they sort of both agree that the news on ecological destruction is foggy. So for instance, Žižek mentions that there seems to be more forest now than there was in the past, although the oceans are still screwed. Žižek sort of mentions in the 80s, there was a huge scare in Germany that by the end of 2000 or wherever, the whole Germany is going to be forestless or something like that. But then it turns out that now Germany has more forests than it did like 30 years ago. The news on large ecological problems is kind of vague, so nobody knows for sure.
Is that really true, though?
I do think it's probably worse than we think.
It seems to me a lot of people who are climate change deniers also tend to be capitalists. They tend to be more in favor of these kind of liberal themes. It does seem like they kind of want to justify not have to worry about some of these problems. I mean, I guess I could see concern about people being alarmist or whatever, but it seems pretty warrant to me. Even in my lifetime, I've seen weather changes that are pretty drastic. That's concerning. To act like this is no big deal, I think, is kind of irresponsible. We'll probably get to a point where resources are such that capitalism is probably going to be outdated, right? If we can actually create a point at which there's sustainable resources enough for everybody, then we won't really need capitalism anymore.
One of the reasons why capitalism still works is because you still need to have people do stupid shit, right? If we eradicated all the stupid jobs, then capitalism would probably have to change. And I think we're probably heading that way unless we have huge societal collapse. The way I see the future is more towards obviously robotization. Universal basic income is a must if we want to sort of have this free market economy. Maybe even in the further future, maybe the ideas like resource-based economy, where, Peter Joseph and Jacques Fresco, but again, that's far in the future, more like a technocratic kind of society, which we will get to a bit as well, because I think Žižek actually believes that Marx actually saw communism more as a technocratic kind of a society. He basically saw happiness as a technical problem, not so much like a problem of human spirit or biology or whatever. Jordan sees corruption not so much as the problem of capitalism, but more like a biologically historic problem. So not so much a capitalist one. Where the hell does he get this idea that if we get 9 billion people, 5,000 GDP per person, if we get over that, people will automatically start caring for the environment, as if this is like this weird magic number. I'm just saying, why don't we just teach people to do that either way, right? But obviously, it's easier to take care of the environment if you are well off. So if you have some kind of a solid ground to stand on and live somewhat okay life.
If you're in a business, there's incentive to make your products cheaper and to get cheap stuff to be able to make it, like cheap packaging. To get the environmentally friendly stuff is often more expensive. So that's why you don't see it. Or when you do see it, it's more expensive as a product. More real cost is built in and they're trying to actually do something good. There's incentive built into the market to favor against sustainable choices. To think that people are going to make those choices, it's just not going to happen. There's no market pressure for that to happen. And a lot of times those options aren't even available. It doesn't seem like a viable solution to me. The only way that you could even begin to change some of that stuff is if you had a lot heavier governmental standards on stuff. Why do we still have styrofoam? Styrofoam doesn't biodegrade. Why is that even allowed to be had? It's cheap. People buy it. It's got tons of places. You go to the gas station, you get some cup that's styrofoam. Why haven't we made that illegal? Like, it's crazy. Like, people don't care. It's a good, cheap option.
And this is the end point of the 10-minute rebuttal from Jordan. Jordan doesn't believe all problems will be solved by capitalism. So he does admit that capitalism is not going to save all the problems. But Jordan truly believes we need to fix our own rooms first, or set our house in order, whatever you want to call it. He emphasizes this point that he does believe that society will be better if we try to clean our rooms first. So this individual level first, and then collective level will follow, which I obviously don't agree, and so doesn't Žižek. But it does seem like Peterson has this boner for individuality.
Žižek's example is, what if you live in North Korea? The problem is not my room isn't clean. The problem is that there's societal things that are part of why my room isn't clean. And that's true in America too. It's not just like you can just focus on cleaning your room and that's going to be it. We're connected, and we do have to do both at the same time. We have to clean our room and engage in the world around us. And he also points to Peterson. He's like, look, you're not just cleaning your room, and we've seen pictures of your room. Shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. So shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. So you're a hypocrite. You don't even take your own advice when it comes to this stuff. You're out here telling other people to be responsible out of one side of your mouth, and then telling them to speak the truth, and then shutting them down when they have some kind of political criticisms that you don't agree with. Super unskillful.
After that, we have a 10-minute response from Slavoj Žižek. It was back and forth. Person had 10 minutes. So then Žižek attacked back with, quote-unquote, attacked with happiness. There was a study where people were actually more happy in Bangladesh as in some Scandinavian countries. He's not saying that all the poor people are happier than the rich people. Blaming other people, communist intervention in Czechoslovakia, life was relatively good, not perfect. Slavoj Žižek is saying that there could be like this silent, perverted happiness. In Czechoslovakia back then, there was meat only like once a month or something. Once that meat came, you remembered how happy you were when the meat came. So it was like this weird mixture of that you needed some things missing, and then those things need to come back, and that makes you happy. Because if you always just had whatever you want, you would not actually be happy. He's sort of arguing that we don't know exactly how and what happiness is. Then he goes on to say there was meat not in the stores every month to remind you how happy you were when it was. So it was this idea, leave us in power and we guarantee you relatively safe life, employment, private pleasure, blah, blah, blah. So this is how sort of communism in Czechoslovakia could be viewed. Leave us alone, just give us what we need. Basically trying to counter-argue the whatever would be a mainstream idea of happiness. Well, what's your opinion on that?
For those people who right now might be thinking that we're extra hard on Peterson, we definitely see his value, but at the same time, we're trying to push the conversation forward, and that means pointing out the problems and talking about how we can do it better.
If somebody's just tuning in, it might seem we are just all hating on Peterson, which we are not. If you look at the Integral Review podcast on the David Long's page, we also still meant Jordan Peterson, but like you said, it's more important, I think, to talk about the things that we feel Jordan is missing. Basically, communists said to Czechoslovakian people, leave us in power and we guarantee you relatively safe life, employment, private pleasure, and so on. He's just trying to undermine traditional idea of happiness, that maybe this is sort of what he says, silent, perverted kind of happiness. I think it's some kind of a Žižek's hobby to sort of analyze happiness in that kind of way.
On one hand, I do think that if we were trying to figure out how to make an optimal society, we would have to figure out how much struggle to build in. I don't think that you want to just give people everything. I think that you got to give people enough room to be able to step into it, to be able to take it up, and then to be able to make progress with it. But I think part of development is definitely going to be struggle. Part of that has got to be built into the system. Like you're saying, currently what we have in terms of capitalism is that you have pacified consumers, people who are taught to express themselves and feel happy by the stuff that they buy. This pacifies people. They're upset, they want to do something about it, they go to the store, they buy something. Capitalism turns people into these kinds of consumers and stuff like that. So again, even framing this in terms of personal happiness, I just feel like it's like a short-sighted measure of the quality of a system. Even utilitarianism kind of breaks down to starting to measure the small bits of figuring out who's happy and who's not or whatnot. But I mean, if you're really in the struggle of working to make yourself better, if you're really like a student kicking butt and trying to do your life, are you happy? Is that how you measure the quality of what you're doing? I don't know if happiness is the most important thing, if that makes sense. It seems like it could be a bit of a non sequitur to this kind of conversation, probably even rooted in some capitalistic assumptions about what quality of life is and stuff like that.
I just think that Žižek wanted to argue that it's not as simple. Although, in my opinion, I think he's sort of nitpicking here. I think that we should probably, if happiness should mean anything, is about meeting people's needs, right? So we could use a Maslow pyramid and say, okay, are these needs met? If somebody said, okay, what is happiness for you? I would say people's needs, and then we go from there. So that's where I would go. Could argue that, yeah, in the Second World War or after it, there are many perversions of this happiness, and you could argue that maybe some oppressed people were secretly happy. Sure, we can make this argument, but I think that's taking the problem here.
People's basic needs should be met in terms of basic happiness. I don't know if that necessarily is the same as happiness, but yeah, quality of life, that kind of stuff, that's super important. I'm not trying to downplay that at all.
Let's go to the next point. So when the wall went down after the Second World War, people said, what a wonder, in Poland, new freedoms and opportunities. The greatest miracle was not the wall being torn down. It was that the Communist Party came to power democratically 4 years later. So this is the argument for corruptive nature of happiness. Happiness should be treated as necessary byproduct. If you focus on it, you're lost. It comes as a byproduct of your working for a cause. So basically, one would argue that when the walls were torn down in Poland and you that the Western liberal values came flooded in, and then 4 years later, Communist Party is elected, maybe happiness is not something so black and white. That's what Žižek has, this perversion towards happiness. China found a perfect balance between communism and capitalism. Communist Party is the best manager of capitalism and protector of workers. The great danger of China is not to flirt with Western ideas. Today's capitalism and democracy are slowly disappearing. So every now and then capitalism needs dictatorship until things improve. So we go back to democracy, like Chile, South Korea, and so on. His argument, does capitalism at some point when it starts to collapse need authoritarian rule for a moment? And when things settle down again, it can go back to a free market economy. Because this is the pattern that we see in Chile, South Korea, and many countries. So what's your opinion?
I think this is why we have a president and as well as Congress and these different branches of government. In America, when we were figuring out how to do this whole thing, there was a lot of talk early on in terms of how we were going to figure stuff out. We know that there's some ways of decision-making process that work better with larger groups, with slow, methodical processes. And then sometimes, for some decisions, you need like a fast, let's decide right here and now, what are we going to do kind of thing. You know, sometimes you need fast decision-making and sometimes you need slow decision-making. I could definitely see when things are going crazy, when things are unstable, it might be good to have a strong leading hand that we can believe in, who we can trust in, and they're going to hopefully help get us out of this thing. But then, yeah, once things settle down and things get together, then it makes sense to want to put into place some of this more slow and methodical kind of decision making. I could see a future world where there's some kind of integral universal standards or something like that, but then there's also different cultural variations where they try different things in different ways. And you could maybe decide, well, this is one way to live and I want to go live in this culture where they do things like this, or maybe I'll go over there and live in a culture where they do things a little bit differently, almost like Harris's idea of different potential peaks where you could thrive on them, where they're not exactly the same, but they both could work. I could imagine a version of capitalism potentially working, just like I could imagine a version of communism potentially working, but they do have to include the other themes nested inside of them in some kind of skillful way. I think we could actually go more towards process-oriented thinking, especially if we move towards something like holacracy that moves quickly. You can actually come to quick conclusions through the process of a more slow type of thing. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And as long as we didn't have wars where we were fighting with each other, I don't think you would need a president. I think part of the reason why we need that fast decision-making process is in wartime, and that's why the president is the chief of the military or whatever. Is part of the reason why we need fast decision-making processes has to do with these kinds of situations, but maybe that would be less of the case.
Like Sam says, there are like many different peaks and valleys, and you can see theme where there's more a system where individuality is more important, but still has that communion in it, and also a society where communion is more important, it has less individuality. And whatever peak or valley you choose, ultimately it's important that both valleys are there. And today in capitalistic world, we have way too much individual themes and not enough
social or communal themes.
I think that's why Nordic countries show the right balance between the social democracy of capitalism and socialism. At some point in the future, we might not have a central figure, or maybe we will always need some central figure. You know, the problem with democracy is that one of the Greek philosophers said it, but democracy doesn't necessarily work if you have stupid people voting, right? You're basically sort of advocating more like a meritocracy, right?
Right, yeah, more like an open, transparent kind of process that anybody could participate in, where it's like all online or something like that, and we could collect good ideas from everywhere. Sure, there might be experts that are working on things in some places, and there probably are official people who act out or test the things that get decided upon or whatever, but for the most part, it would be based on rationality and an open source peer review or something like that, taking good ideas from everywhere, putting them on the table. I think you could totally come up with a program to do this. There's only so many variations on a theme. Around these kinds of arguments, there are only so many different ideas that are put on the table, and then those ideas have sub-ideas and variations or whatever. Like, we could map all that, I think. We could take a very systematized approach to figuring out how to test a lot of that stuff and figure out what's actually good and what actually works. And it might be that multiple things work, but at least we could have a more rational, open, let's test it, let's refine it, let's work on it kind of a thing, instead of thinking that one person is going to know everything and have the final solution. Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. I think that feels more like a technocratic answer. And
yes,
I definitely agree that you should have not so much a board of directors in terms of capitalistic sense, but a board of like social engineers almost, but more ethical social engineers who really do want well-being for the most people, not who just want to make as much money as possible. So So I would see that something in the future, but unfortunately we're not quite there yet. Till then, we still need this daddy authoritarian figure, not necessarily a totalitarian leader, but something like Obama, like Hillary, like Trump. It does seem like our civilization still needs the daddy. And I think Jordan Peterson is another example of that neediness for the daddy. I think younger generation, the more mature secular generations who are not brainwashed with this neoliberal capitalistic agenda, I think could inevitably have this kind of system, in my opinion.
Another good Adam Curtis film to watch is All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace, where he kind of says that to some extent that kind of idea that I just advocated for is what free market capitalists want the market to be to some extent. There's a very similar overarching idea that we'll create a system that will figure it out, and it won't be just based on any one person's ideas. For them, it's the hand of the market. For us, it's maybe more like science applied to evolution kind of an approach. But there are definitely some overarching themes that I think are interesting and worth exploring, and those also might be good ways to start to build bridges between some of this stuff. In the same way that communists will often say, oh, that's not real communism. A lot of times capitalists will be like, oh, but this isn't real laissez-faire capitalism. This isn't the real market. It's corrupted by the state or whatever. That seems to be the narrative. There's a way in which what we're talking about is kind of the synthesis here, this kind of, no, this is the real democratic free market of ideas. It's not just a matter of any one person or some kind of authority deciding, that the system itself decides this could actually, if done right, this kind of technocratic solution could be a middle position between the two, where we can say we agree with your idea of a free market, and also we want to have real democracy, and also it's a communal kind of system where we share resources. People don't seem to have really considered the different ingredients and the different options around some of these things. They kind of just think of it in a simple black and white way, when there's a bunch of different ways that you could have capitalism and a bunch of different ways you could have communism.
The reason why we have capitalism is because there is idea that people are naturally greedy. Your neighbor will try to destroy you if he has a chance. If you really believe that, then you will start inevitably act as if that is really the case. A lot of the problem is, what are people's fundamental ideas of human nature? Capitalists did a great job of tricking people into thinking, this is all natural. This is how people are. People want to have unlimited resources. All people are just greedy. I think America has fallen for it. I think Europe is not as much. I think younger people are waking up to these problems. But Jordan, basically, all his theories come from these neoliberal, Darwinistic kind of evolutionary, strawman evolutionary ideas. He makes some very superficial assumptions about human nature.
Do you know who Cornel West is? Well, this is a dude who's another professor of philosophy, and he's like a civil rights dude, a black dude, and he would consider himself to be Christian in a similar way to how Peterson probably would. But it seems to me that he probably would have a lot more Christian answers about, especially as a black man in America coming in the civil rights movement, about the injustice built into the system, more care for the poor. From a Christian perspective, he would probably be more inclined to agree with us, whereas Peterson seems to be more of a modern capitalist when it comes to this kind of stuff than really a Christian.
The only Christian part, I guess, Jordan would take it is that, so if he combines like Christianity and Darwinism in a way, then he might say that people are by their nature destructive, right? Selfish or whatever, born in sin. You need these rules and higher values for them to strive. And if you don't have them, they will just regress. Again, it's like Richard's fallacy. Sure, you can of course say that's not the case. Christianity can have more communal themes, but I think Jordan, just because of his Darwinistic kind of view, maybe sees Christianity differently than you. It's hard to say. Going back to Marx, Jordan presents Marx oversimplistically. Žižek agrees on many Jordan's criticisms of Marx. Marx didn't have a good theory of how social power exists. His idea was simply the disappearance of class structure. Žižek is also saying that Marx was secretly a technocrat, although he would never admit it. He basically saw as that communism would be run by experts as a machine. So something maybe we hinted at before, that a lot of this is a technical problem, not so much a social one. Marx was at least aware of the problem. That's why he was so enthusiastic about the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune was a radical socialist revolutionary government that ruled Paris from 18 March to 28th of May in 1871. That was not centralized. It's not defending Marx. It was just not clear to him how social power works. So Žižek is not defending Marx. He is arguing that Marx didn't have a good awareness of how social power works. Going on, there is a passage where Marx criticizes equality, and he was criticizing the critique of Gotha program is document based on letter by Karl Marx written in early 1875 to the Social Democratic Workers' Party in Germany. Marx dismisses dismisses equality as bourgeoisie category. Communism is not egalitarianism. Yes, hierarchies, but not on free market capitalism. So again, this is Peterson strawmanning Marx as if Marx is for this absolute equality. This is not the case. Marx is not saying hierarchies are bad. He's just saying that the potential hierarchies that free market is going to create are bad for the proletariat. And he was right. Jordan strawmanning the hell out of Marx here. Žižek pointed that out.
Well, this is what happens when you talk about some stuff that you've never studied. This is what happens when you
only just read Communist Manifesto and not some other thing. So I give credit to Žižek for actually pointing out that how Peterson hasn't cleaned his room.
Shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. Shit's not clean. So you're a hypocrite. You don't even take your own advice when it comes to this stuff. Hasn't done his homework.
We need global action, yet cannot leave it to the market. So again, Žižek sort of argues that the free market is not going to save the ocean. Žižek agrees free market capitalism is not going to save all the problems. So again, just agrees that poor people are better off in capitalism, and data seems to suggest that, but just leaving everything to free market capitalism is not going to work. That's all he was trying to say. So that was basically the ending statement of Žižek in the second rebuttal. Do you have anything to add?
Just because poor people seem to be doing a little bit better, there's so many other factors. There's a correlation also with life in general improves with a whole bunch of technology making things better and making a lot of the stuff more accessible. Strictly correlate that to this one particular type of way of running the system, especially when we haven't really tried a healthy version of this other way of running a system. It doesn't mean a lot to say this is the best system we've ever had, one of the only versions that we've really tried in the context of the kind of world that we live in. In the context of history, it's like claiming to have figured it all out when you just started. It's kind of ridiculous. It's giving yourself a little bit too much credit.
Žižek sees Marx as a great systemic thinker, but he considers himself more a Hegelian. Žižek doesn't see himself as Marxist, but admires Marx's systemic thinking and sees its great achievements in criticizing capitalist economies. Not in Manifesto, but his detailed work. Žižek is promoting going from Marx to Hegel and identifies himself as Hegelian. Marxism saw proletarian communism as a solution for something or an end goal, but Hegel knew that any change will hurt the other. There is no pure position of acting, as if you know what you're doing is absolutely good or right. Hegel said philosophy cannot predict the future, can only see the problem from the past when society is in decline. But we need radical openness, new cognitive mapping. This is where we hope integral comes in, right? We don't have clear stand on where we are and how we are moving. Anything you ever do, any position you ever have will inevitably hurt somebody.
Yeah, I think that's right. Even if we were like, okay, we know how to create the optimal society, even if we knew what that was, to implement that, to put that into place, people are going to be upset. There's going to be transitional pains. There's going to be things that people don't like. No matter what you do to try to correct society, some people are going to be put out by it. Some people are going to be upset by it. With the whole Hegel and Marx thing, it's kind of interesting because Wilbur is neo-Hegelian. He tends to take up a lot of idealistic, ontological, cosmological themes of Hegel, whereas Marx was more of a materialist, like a dialectical materialist. The way that I talk about it and some other people like the metamodernist people is like we're almost switching from Hegel to Marx to be less about spirit and more about actually achieving things in the world. One of Marx's ideas was that he didn't want to just talk about things. He wanted to get involved and actually do things. Coming back around to what you're saying, what Žižek is saying, he wants to move from Marx to Hegel, going from these kinds of strict positions to a more analytical, let's try and figure out what's going on here. Let's not just take one kind of pure approach. So I think that he's right about that, if that's what he means by going back to Hegel, this idea of questioning things more. I do think that what we're talking about is a type of synthesis of these ideas, of being able to be active in the world, but also finding a systematic way to be more rational and take into account things from the back end and test them, to not just be ideological with things, to start from this assumption of we don't know how to do things, so let's see if we can figure it out and then see what works. The good thing about this is that it will allow for developments in society to potentially happen a lot faster. The potentially negative thing about this is that to some extent you turn a lot of your subjects in society into test subjects. But what else can you do except for try things, hopefully get people's consent to try them to see if they work, or you just come down with some totalitarian type stuff. Even that, if you did create this kind of new society and you did get a bunch of people to adopt it and to agree to be a part of it, let's say you got some kind of social contract where you get consent, the next generation born into that society are going to be victims to it. They didn't ask to be born. No one got their permission on this is the world that they wanted to live in. To some extent, there's always going to be a little bit of that. I think there has to be some kind of a middle position where we both take action as well as analyze and try to refine and figure out what's going on. It can't just be one or the other.
Yeah, and I think this test subject problem, if you look from a more meta perspective, we are all a test subject already anyway.
Right.
For all we know, we could live in a test subject kind of laboratory and some aliens are watching us, or we are on a simulation on a Mormon computer, like Sam Harris would argue. I think that whether we are test subjects or not is kind of irrelevant. I think as long as we are trying to do our best we can from the knowledge we have so far in terms of what can we do to make society a better place, with the problem of being test subject is not moral or whatever, I think that's even irrelevant anyway, because we are test subjects anyway, right?
Yeah, nobody asked to be born into this thing. Part of trying to make a more optimal society is to try to respect people's autonomy and give them consent and the ability to be able to do some of this stuff. I do think it's a valid concern worth addressing.
So this is where Žižek called Peterson out. Where are the Marxists? So you criticize postmodernists as neo-Marxists. Where are the Marxists here? Where are the Marxists here? They are just egalitarian who are for equality and have nothing to do with Marxism. Jordan is hyper-moralizing those people, which is for Žižek a quiet sign of defeat. They don't have a genuine will to change society. It's more like a very impotent moralization, which is what Žižek says. The most we can say about those people is they just want to have some kind of a social capitalism. That's the most we can say. Maybe sure, some extreme versions, maybe they are Marxists, but the way Jordan is portraying these postmodernists and neoliberals as if they are Marxists is hugely impotent. And also, Jordan doesn't seem to understand is that these capitalistic values, basically he's sort of saying that Jordan is that alt-right person who's blaming Marxism for everything. And Jordan, he doesn't see that is the capitalism that is creating postmodernism. Jordan has his blind spots, and I think Žižek did a great job calling him out on this argument. And when he was painted, he named one person. And then he said, well, you know, I read some study that 25% of professors consider themselves Marxists. But Jordan, you're calling the whole left as Marxist, basically. All postmodernists are Marxist for you. Details here are important. Who is the Marxist here? Because he's strawmanning Marxism so much, he doesn't see that he's actually just making more fire for no reason. These leftists are not Marxists, and these are not true Marxists. And again, this is just very, very poor job from Jordan Peterson. People saw just how weak Jordan is on this issue of postmodernism and Marxism. This is where Jordan sort of dropped the ball for me in this debate and showed his true color of unawareness.
That's a really good point. This is why I think Žižek was able to play it cool, is because he knew Peterson doesn't really know what he's talking about. He's like, listen, this is not just some like gotcha, you're full of ish. Even in framing it like that, it's kind of like sort of bringing up those words in relation to him, and his next response demonstrates that he was got and he was exposed as being full of ish. He basically goes, oh, okay, they're not really Marxist, but what it is that Marxism is just equivalent to a victim mentality. All of these people who have cultural identities that feel oppressed or whatever, that's just Marxism. People who use this same kind of victim mentality, us and them mentality. Yeah. Christians must be all Marxists too, because they're oppressed and they have this kind of narrative of being a marginalized group that's, you know, hated on. And Muslims also are Marxist, right? Because they're...
Another funny thing is that, yeah, obviously everybody can be Marxist by definition, but you know what's the most ironic thing? That he became famous using this exact tactic. He was the one who went preaching outside his Toronto University about free speech, misrepresented the C-16 bill in Canada. And then he went out, he was advocating free speech. Some people attacked him a bit. And then he became the victim and made himself more, oh, now I have the moral high ground because these postmodernists are attacking me. So he basically is using the same tactic that he's accusing of postmodernists, and this is how he became famous.
By playing the victim, doing this us and them stuff. By that definition, he's a Marxist. What does it mean to be a Marxist at this point? It's really at this point to when his whole thing is exposed and it's clear that he has no idea what he's talking about and that he's just talking fish. Throwing around this word Marxism and communism as some kind of demonized strawman scapegoat like the people in the past have. Even still, without really ever giving a sympathetic read or trying to consider it as having any viable or good things to say, or even to consider that it could possibly have truth to it. It's a real pathetic intellectual demonstration or lack thereof.
I sort of felt that this part and the next part we're going to talk about was sort of the height of this debate. And I think Žižek did a good job exposing Peterson, but also not trying to like destroy him. I think Žižek did a good job to still keep it civil, still keep it humorous. Peterson then counters back by saying that in France in 1916, Foucault and Derrida, the most famous postmodern philosophers, lost the moral battle after whole Stalinist, Maoist catastrophe. They basically changed the problem from economical struggle of Marxism, identified struggle, which is the same as the oppressor versus the oppressed. Instead of proletarian versus bourgeoisie, they smuggle the fundamental Marxist argument without admitting they did. So instead of proletarian versus bourgeoisie or the poor versus the rich, it's now oppressors versus the oppressed. And that's why he pictures all the postmodernists as the oppressed, and therefore they have the quote-unquote moral high ground. And then Žižek argues that Foucault was actually criticizing Marxism, but then they switched the subject. So after that, Peterson said, yeah, maybe we're going to get to that topic afterwards, and they never did, because this is where I think Peterson would probably expose himself. How little does he really know about postmodernism? The fact that he didn't even know that Foucault was actually criticizing Marx, and postmodernism and Marxism is not the same thing. Maybe even Jordan knows that there are differences. He does know that postmodernism is like criticizing the meta theory or doubt everything, whatever. It does seem like Peterson's view on all this is extremely foggy and superficial based on what Žižek was able to expose here.
This is why wise intellectuals stay in their lane, because this will happen to them. They'll get exposed.
And then they switch topic back to happiness. Peterson agrees with Žižek. It should be a side effect of individual to strive for highest responsibility towards good, and it needs to be personalized and universalized. He's using Judeo-Christian ethics as a vehicle, what we should follow, as a foundation for well-being and striving for goodness, and that goodness should be a Judeo-Christian narrative. But he also admits that we should be becoming better and better and more mature and more complex. So Peterson does understand that complexity is part of growing up, although he is extremely unaware of complexity of postmodernism or green in general, right? He only sees the flaws but doesn't see the pros of postmodernism, and if we want to use Sparrow language, the orange, greeny, green, yellow. I think Jordan has these vague ideas that there are stages of development, but like you said in your video, he's by far not integral based on what he's saying. To me, he's more like blue, orangey with some hints of green when it's useful for him. But for him to be even great at green, I think he's not even there yet. But this was just Peterson's response. So basically, they both agree that we shouldn't strive for happiness, we should be responsible. And again, we both agree with Peterson on that. We should be responsible at individual. But at what point do we draw the line between what can a system do to make us even more responsible? So again, it's a balance between both. Peterson is still overemphasizing individuality. It's got to be both. And this is what Žižek is arguing for. So,
and we agree.
Žižek then makes an interesting point, which I want to see your take. In other religions, we got out there, we fall from God, and we try to climb back. But in Christianity, your separation from God is part of divinity itself. How would you respond to that?
It's got metaphorical value, that's for sure. Part of being this divine being that we are is that we're also embodied in this kind of context, this sort of, it's this dual nature, realizing this non-dual perspective of both the absolute and relative truth, the absolute truth of unity and interconnectedness, and that we're all part of this one universe in flux. If we want to say that the absolute is divine, I like that. I'm good with that. Part of what it is to be at all is to not only be one with everything, but also to feel separate and cut off, alone. And that is part of the experience. Now, in terms of his narrative about the stories of other traditions versus the Christian story, that's, I don't know. Every symbol set has its own different variations, and they might all have their own different kinds of poetic value. Maybe he's just pointing to Christianity as being one of the traditions that emphasizes the nature of separateness and suffering in an extraordinary kind of way.
So then this is another big question. Žižek asks Jordan, why emphasis on setting your house in order, which is cleaning your room?
Shit's not clean. So
why has Jordan never thought about the fact that your house is not in order because society is not in order? I will give you an ultimate example. Yourself. Why are you so socially active? It's not enough to tell your patients to set their house in order. The reason their house is in disorder is because their society is in disorder. You would not say that in North Korea. The same problem is with recycling. He's arguing that, yeah, you can delude yourself in thinking, well, I'm recycling, so fuck it, right? And it's not so easy. You can't just reduce all the world's problem in setting one's house in order. Again, this is a good point from Žižek. Yeah, the reason why is Jordan not just talking to his patients? Why does he have to pronounce this and write a book? Isn't that try for a systemic change? He's arguing for individual changes. All the change that he's doing now is societal changes. At least he's trying to do that. So it's kind of a weird irony. He's using social change while trying to help people clean their own room on the individual level.
And these are the valid points that you would want to make against that. The reason why your room is dirty is in part because society is messed up. Maybe his response to that would be something like, all you can really do is work on yourself first and foremost. There are good reasons why you would start there, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to do other things in the world to make it better. And then also, it'd be so easy to be just self-satisfied, like, well, I recycle, or, well, I'm a vegan, so I guess I'm done. I did my part. And it's just, it doesn't work like that. It's not enough. It's not good enough to do your part. Each of us doing our part is not going to work, which is also, by the way, for those of you who are interested in like integral hacks into capitalism, this conscious capitalism and conscious consumerism, being a conscious consumer or having a conscious business does not fix capitalism. Like, it's not a solution. Being a responsible member of capitalism doesn't fix capitalism. You would have to get everybody to be responsible for that to work. And then that's not capitalism anymore.
Peterson sort of answers, there is a clinical study. If you want to develop resilience, you need exposure to problems. So psychoanalysis is exposing you to your past, cognitive therapy to your present. So the best solution to the problem is to help people on individual level so they can get themselves well enough so they become capable of addressing larger scale problems without falling prey to some sort of errors, over optimism, or intellectually arrogant ideologues, which he assumes Marxism. If you take a personal problem serious enough, you will save a social problem, Carl Gustav Jung said, which I don't agree with. The same goes for your relationship. Saving problems there can help you address larger issues. Saving your relationship or fixing the problems there will not save global warming. Again, this is extremely limited view. I can understand that in some metaphorical sense, it could be a useful way of thinking about it, but none of these individual things will save societal problems.
Right.
Social problems need social intervention. Individual problems need individual interventions will not save social problems. Again, this is extremely limited view on the subject. We already talked about this in an integral review.
The quadrants are interconnected. You can work on the upper left quadrant and potentially it will help the other quadrants, or any quadrant for that matter. But in order for real systemic change to happen, we need 4 quadrant solutions. You got to both want to recycle, have a community of pressure in place to say, around here we recycle, and you have to have a system in place to allow for recycling. All of those things have to be happening. You can't just focus on one quadrant and think that you're going to come up with real solutions. It doesn't work like that.
Then Žižek goes on to say that your falling creates a path to come back. So you need to fall to create a redemption. You didn't fall from heaven. The fall self needed to happen so heaven can be created. Žižek is an atheist and he sees human fall as an opportunity for something to be created. So if you don't fall from anything, there's nothing to strive for. There's no original heaven, right? Heaven is only created when something falls. So the heaven is created while falling. Peterson said people are a combination of ideas, following your bliss, what appears for you to be meaningful. Peterson has this sense that people have inherent moral compass, which is driven by a Judeo-Christian evolutionary biological idea. This obviously can be debated, but this is where he stands. So to really know who you are, stop saying things you know not to be true. So people have deep compass inside them that tells them something is right or wrong. Stop doing the wrong things and start doing the right things in a small way. Hope your vision will clear up in the future and you will find yourself in some kind of process of redemption. Nothing new here, but Žižek brought up another interesting point. What totalitarian regimes try to do is to say, do what you think is wrong for the higher cause. Heinrich Himmler knew that German officers must do bad things, so it must take a truly great man to go against his morality for the higher cause. Here, the Žižek sees the danger of false meaning. Heinrich Himmler, who was a Nazi officer, had a book called Bhagavad Gita. Heinrich's solution was Orientalism, Eastern philosophy. And here Žižek found a new book called Zen at War. It tells people that reality is illusionary, and this is where sort of Wilber comes in as well, and you're a mutual observer of a knife going through a person's body. Žižek argues that even the most enlightened philosophy like Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever ism can be dangerous taken out of context. And this is basically saying that you can use Buddhism to motivate German officers to do bad things.
Almost any perspective can be dangerous given to the wrong person. I think this is also part of why we don't teach integral to people who are lower down the spiral. Part of what a skillful integral practitioner will do is engage with people and manipulate them towards their higher development. So you could easily take the same knowledge and use it to manipulate people in really bad ways if you wanted to. What do they say? The Darth Vader move is always possible. Ideas are dangerous, and definitely even the best ideas can be used in bad ways.
This part of Žižek's criticism, if you see yourself like this mutual observer kind of way, and you're not really holding a knife, not really going through another person's flesh. Again, it's a similar thing when Wilber said that if you want to save all suffering, suffering, you just need to wake up.
You can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately.
So is this Eastern disassociation from the real world and seeing yourself as this higher spiritual being, which could be another form of spiritual bypassing? I think Žižek has a right to worry that you can take every enlightened philosophy or religion, even from the East, and the East is one of those more like pure, I guess, especially Buddhism seems to be the most like pure in terms of the least superstition, and even that can be turned into something that's super dangerous. I think it's interesting that Žižek pointed that out. Peterson said, it's nice to have an open and honest conversation, even if we don't agree, the same as Harry's one. And Žižek said, I hope we give people something to think about. And also, if you are leftist, don't be politically correct. That's what Žižek said. And this is how the whole debate finished. What's your opinion on Slovenian philosopher Žižek? How integral do you think he is based on your limited exposure?
Man, I do not feel like I understand him well enough to make judgments about his altitude. If I had to guess, I'd probably guess that he's somewhere between green and yellow. Here's another thing that I want to say. When I think about a person's altitude, I don't like to just think about them in terms of one stage of development. I think it's better to think about a person as being in between two stages. Maybe they're late green, early integral or something like that, or they're late orange, early green. It's better to think about people as being in process in the first place. So this is kind of just a good way to see people more in developmental flux in the first place and less like pigeonholing them in some kind of static view. Because in general, I think people's cognitive runs ahead and then they will realize some of that stuff and then they'll act it out. Like, I know people who cognitively are orange, they tend to have a lot of blue ideas as their general stage of gravity, and then they also tend to act out a lot of red stuff still. To just put a person in a particular box is, I think, kind of unskillful, especially in a summary kind of way. You wouldn't just go, oh, this person's this. Thinking about people in terms of being on a cusp is one way I block against that a little bit.
I try to stay away from labeling people to be specific color. I think that especially people at the beginning integral tend to just strawman people into, oh, he's just orange, he's just blue, he's just red or whatever. I think spiral, as useful as it is, it can also feel like ungrateful judgment, or maybe not ungrateful, but you can easily use spiral to diminish somebody. Let's try to usually even stay away from saying, well, you're blue, you're green or whatever. Based on my limited understanding of Žižek, I would probably give him somewhere between green and yellow. And I would definitely say that Žižek is a lot more knowledgeable in philosophy than Peterson could ever dream of.
I think he has a philosophy movie on Netflix as well. I like his approach to the debate. I think it was actually pretty skillful. I think his approach seemed to be a kind of integral approach, more about trying to establish agreements and get on the inside and to play against the kind of archetypes that he was trying to strawman Marxists as, just in a demonstrable kind of way. And his approach of meeting the other person halfway and being gracious, I thought he was really skillful. I think in one hand, when it comes to actually arguing the points of the debate, I don't even think he was really a Marxist. I don't even think they were really talking about what the topic was. If somebody won the debate, it was probably Peterson. But I think Žižek, I think he won the day in that he disproved a lot of the things that Jordan had been saying about Marxists, just demonstrably. And he also exposed the fact that Peterson didn't know what he was talking about and was painting with a broad brush and all this stuff. Even though I don't feel like Žižek at the end of the day really even made a case for Marxism or said much about happiness, really, or happiness under Marxism versus capitalism. I don't know who came up with the frame for this thing. I do think he was successful in a more big picture kind of way beyond just the frame of the debate, if that makes sense. And Peterson succeeded in that he didn't punch Žižek in the face. So that's pretty good.
If the debate was to prove what is better, either Marxism or capitalism, I do think that Peterson won the debate. But who won the debate in terms of philosophical talking points? I do think Žižek sort of, obviously we can throw a bone to Peterson. Peterson's not a philosopher. More and more you listen to him, more you sort of see that there's a lot of issues he doesn't see. I give credit to Peterson that he's a great psychologist and a lot of his ideas are useful. But in terms of philosophy, Žižek could have obliterated him a lot more if he wanted.
Oh, yeah.
He could have pressed him on more issues. He could have asked him, oh, what did you read about Marxism? Okay, communists, what else did you read? So what's your opinion on Foucault criticizing Marxism? And he would probably just be quiet and like, well, yeah, I didn't read that part, blah, blah. blah, blah. I don't know how he would weasel himself out of it, right? He'd probably just say, well, all our ideas are fundamentally wrong, so who am I to say? Scapegoating.
Žižek played it cool.
I think the way Žižek tried to do, he used Peterson's ideas against him by giving real-world examples or hypothetical examples of how one could interpret Peterson's ideas in exact opposite way. And he did it within Peterson's ground. I think Žižek did a very good job at making people think and also opening up people to seeing that Marxism is not as simple as Jordan is portraying. And the same goes with postmodernism. All in all, I like the debate. At the beginning, he kind of dragged off. At the end, where Žižek sort of presented his heavy artillery, he showed us that at the end of the day, Peterson is extremely lackluster on the topic of Marxism and postmodernism. I even said in the integral review, in response to Mario and the original 12 Rules for Life, he is not a systemic thinker and he is weak on that subject. And more I hear Peterson speak, the more I see that lower right quadrant is not his friend. That's sort of my take. But I think debate was great and needed because I think Harris sometimes goes way too much into the battle of rationality versus religion, although he admits that there are useful things you can get from religion. But I think that Žižek did a better job in debating Peterson because he's more knowledgeable in the micro ideas that can be used against Peterson. Sam Harris is not. So I actually enjoyed this debate as much as I did with Jordan and Sam Harris. So what's your summary?
I found it kind of frustrating. I think I was one of those people who also wanted to see Jordan Peterson taken down a peg. And after his opening statement, I was like wanting it even more, to be honest with you. I was like, man, I know a lot of people are going to be on this idea of debates don't have to be adversarial or whatever. And maybe big picture, it might be better, depending on how it's done. It might be better that it went this way than it was a for real takedown. If you talk shit in public about a bunch of stuff, I kind of want to see your feet get held to the fire, especially if you're talking about things that you don't really know about. I don't know. I think part of debate is a little bit Enter the Thunderdome type style. I still want to see a more critical takedown, but maybe maybe that'll be one day in the future. If we're really being honest, I think Peterson had his moment. I think he's said just about every interesting thing that he's going to say. I'm kind of done hearing from him. I would kind of like to see him get exposed a little bit and like his ass handed to him, a little bit more humility to be put into his worldview and for people to see through him a little bit. Part of ideas getting popular means that you're going to get the dumbed down versions of them. In one hand, I'm very happy if Jordan Peterson turns more people on to debates and philosophy and wanting to think about things. If that happens, it's all for the good. A lot of philosophers that people originally get into when they get into philosophy are the more immature, simple kind of philosophers, and they get further into some of the depth. As far as what Peterson brings to the table, it's nothing new, and the versions of it that he brings are not as good as the versions of it that the people who have come before him have brought. To me, Jordan is kind of like a dumbed-down hack version of a philosopher. We try to be nice to him because a lot of people are coming to us who could potentially be his fans, but I want to be honest about this stuff too. He does have a lot of good ideas. Part of the reason why I think that a lot of people are drawn to him is because there are powerful, important things in there. Joseph Campbell is a powerful figure who had a change my lifestyle impact on me. And in a lot of ways, Jordan Peterson is doing and saying a lot of the same things that Joseph Campbell was saying. And these are things that not really a lot of other people are saying. And so it was nice to have some exposure to some of those ideas back in the culture again. But Jordan Peterson brings with it so much baggage and so many other bad ideas. He really is the hack, dumbed down version of a lot of this stuff. And if you care about that stuff, to see this pale imitation style version, even if it's real deep to a lot of other people, it's frustrating. I'm very torn about it. There's a lot of things I like about Jordan Peterson, but also he pisses me off. There's things that I don't like about him too. He's very regressive, and that I find to be dangerous. In a time when we want to be moving forward, he's inviting people to stay conventional. That worries me. I have a lot of mixed feelings around Jordan as a popular figure. Like I said, I like the fact that we're having these big debates and that stuff is popular. I would like to see better voices be able to maintain some of the more public conversations. Don't you think he helps dumb young men? I do. I think he's helpful. I definitely think he's a valuable voice in all of this. I just think we could do better. I don't know. I'm a little disappointed by the whole thing.
I agree with all those things. As soon as we try to move on for whatever topic we have, Peterson sneaks back in and we need to talk about him yet again. Because we talk about him on numerous occasions occasions. You already made quite a few videos. He just doesn't want to go away, man.
I know, right?
And I'm sure there's going to be more talks, because I'm sure this is not the last talk they're going to have with Žižek. They almost like set it up. There's going to be a continuation. I want to say that I agree with you that maybe now that I think about what you said, Žižek should pin him down more and make him, if he's a public figure criticizing, make him work for it. Just go into details. Say, oh, so how Foucault criticized him? Oh, did you read Das Kapital from Marx and other books and other essays? And we would see how the public would react, how Peterson supporters would react, and maybe that would even force them to grow a bit and think, oh, maybe Jordan is not all powerful, almighty intellectual as a lot of people on the right. For somebody who's somewhat philosophically inclined, he can tear down Jordan. If I had a debate or you had a debate, we would probably be able to tear him down.
Totally.
I might insult some people, but he is a great influence for dumb people. And those ideas are very useful in some basic kind of way. But in the society we live in now, in this multicultural technological utopia where there are many ideas, Jordan is just an old donkey whose time is up. He's too old school at this point. He doesn't see the limitation of his ideas. Like you said, there are many others who've done a better job than he did, and maybe he's going to change in the future. Maybe he's going to get under pressure and he's going to see things differently. But from what I'm seeing so far, he's just the same old Jordan Peterson for me. And although he acts as if he's open to new ideas, he's still holding on to traditional ideas too much. I'm not sure if there's anything more we can get from Jordan. I think this is his pinnacle of development. Great for certain type of people at certain level of development, but beyond that, I don't think he brings anything valuable to the table. That's sort of my ending statement around this Jordan fiasco.
I tend to agree. I think the high point in this whole situation for me was getting to hear Peter Joseph talk about it and rip it apart a little bit. To me, that was the best part of this whole thing. Someone like Peter Joseph, I wish he got some more shine because he is incredibly intelligent, really well spoken.
I think he is one of the best systemic lower right thinkers in the world. I think he got a lot of heat because of the 9/11 conspiracies and that astrotheology when he did the first and the second side. A lot of people, especially on the right, might see him as this conspiracy theory Marxist. However they see him, he sort of denounced himself from that, and he hinted at some point that maybe he made some mistakes there, right?
Sure.
Seeing him now with that video, and he just took like 1 hour, and he made Jordan Peterson look like a 5-year-old kid.
Yeah, it's embarrassing.
It's embarrassing, yeah. He said he didn't have a lot of preparation. He just did it like this, like,
oh,
I'm
yeah,
just going to watch and say what I think. If he tried to debate Jordan Peterson, he would probably just tear him apart.
Oh, yeah. No contest.
Joseph did a great job. Yeah, it would be no contest at all. And sure, Joseph has his weaknesses as well. I think Integral could help him a lot as well, especially stages of development.
Just today, somebody posted on my wall here in this group asking me if we think that Integral should try to make connections in some of these other communities that might be sympathetic, and his name came up.
I think it would be great if we would be able to talk to Peter Joseph.
Definitely, I would put him on my very short list of top intellectuals alive right now. He would be in my top 5. Yeah, I would love that. I would love to figure out some way to connect with him and connect Integral in the Zeitgeist movement. Can't say enough good stuff about Peter Joseph. So, do you want to give stars to this or something, man?
Well, I still am satisfied that at least Žižek did expose Peterson to some extent. And that's even more important than Harry's Peterson. I would give this 4 stars. And I agree with you that if he exposed him even more, then it could potentially be a 5-star thing. But from that point, maybe it was still too safe. But I still love that he did as much as he did, Žižek exposing him to not knowing what he's talking about. For that, 4 stars. Although I assume you would probably go lower.
So you're already assuming I'm going to go lower than 4 stars.
I'm pretty sure you're going to go lower.
I'm going to give it 3 stars. And I'm going to give Peter Joseph's review of it 5 stars. I'm going to give the actual debate 3 stars because I have to listen to Jordan Peterson say a bunch of dumb things, and that was painful. And on the back end of that, I would have liked to seen him get dismantled a little bit more. That's why I'm going to give it 3 stars. If Peterson would have done a better job, if he would have steelmanned his opponent a little bit, if he would have done more work to know what he was talking about, if he would have done less straw manning, and if he would have just spent a little bit more time establishing some goodwill in the beginning like he's done in the past in other debates, maybe he would have got less into the straw mans and he would have had a better debate. But I think Peterson's demonstration in this debate is not good. It was unskillful. I think they both could have done better. Either Žižek could have kicked his butt more, and I would have liked that, or Jordan Peterson could have stepped it up more, and I would have liked that. As it sits, I'm only going to give it 3 stars, especially because it doesn't even really deliver on the promise of what it's talking about. It just feels it doesn't deliver.
I would guess this was some orange marketing thing marketing behind that one, right? Because it's,
probably.
I think it's a great marketing kind of way. And I heard that the event sold well. There's one good thing about Jordan. He does seem to be a helpful hand in bringing all these conversations more into the mainstream. And not so much like CNN mainstream, but in terms of more and more people want to be engaged, more and more young people like Jordan, Žižek, Harris, who are making this into a lot more huge thing, because it used to be a very narrow Oxford University kind of circuit, but now it's a lot more broader. If O2 Arena is being sold out, I think that's a good thing. So even for all the criticisms, at least we can give hand to Peterson for being open to debates and also bringing them to a larger social environment. So I'll give that praise to Jordan.
I'll support you on that. I think that's good. I think we need more debates. There need to be more public intellectuals that people care about. I'm super happy about that. I'm glad that people are excited about debates. I have never seen this where they're selling out these big arenas and stuff like that to do talks and debates. That's really exciting. And as much as I'm not a huge fan of Peterson himself, I definitely am a fan of more people getting excited about talking about ideas. Is that a good note to end it on?
I think it is. I'm already exhausted.
Thanks so much for watching Integral Review Live here in the I Am David Long Friends and Fans group, recording it live. If you're not on that on Facebook yet, what are you doing? Get on it. Anyways, make sure you like and subscribe. Share us with your friends on all the social medias that you can think of. And peace.
Peace.